Welcome to the Right to Reason podcast. I'm your host, Robert Stanley. Today we are discussing postmodernism with Ozymandias Ramses II.
It's the Right to Reason podcast.
I'm hoping today that we can talk a bit about postmodernism and I can give expression to some of the concerns that I have with postmodernism and where I think it goes wrong. This is Ozymandias Ramses II, and you're listening to The Right to Reason.
This episode of the Right to Reason podcast is brought to you by our patrons and contributors like me. We have all recognized the value of the unrestrained marketplace of ideas and have decided to make a difference. You can make a difference too. Contribute at patreon.com/right and learn more about your right to reason at therighttoreason.com. Your activism is appreciated.
Ozymandias Ramses II, I gotta tell you, you are my favorite guest that I have ever had, and I'm so glad to have you back on.
Wow, thank you. That's some high praise. I know you've had some high caliber guests, so thank you so much.
Well, yeah, but you're my kind of philosophy nerd. You know what I mean? Like, you will start talking, or I'll watch one of your videos on YouTube. And if anybody wants to find this guy, Ozymandias Ramses II on YouTube, Facebook. Can you spell that for me real quick?
It's Ozymandias. That's Ozymandias. The second name is Ramses, Ramses, the second. So two eyes, basically. Yeah. It's on Facebook. Find him on YouTube. Fantastic videos. You'll learn a lot. And a lot of your stuff is about faith and religion and that sort of thing. One of the fascinating things that I really pegged in on is a lot of these topics are similar to someone else that seems to be just gaining in popularity right now, Jordan Peterson. I understand that he is a former acquaintance of yours, as it were. Yeah. Well, it's a very thin acquaintance.
Okay, fair enough.
When I was an undergraduate student in psychology at McGill University in Montreal, he was my teaching assistant. Because I knew him, so he would have been about 26. He was working on his PhD. I was working on my undergraduate degree in psychology. And he was an excellent TA, actually. He was a really good, very conscientious TA. And
Is he a nice guy?
Yeah, he was a nice guy. You could have a good conversation with him. I wrote a paper that he disagreed with very strenuously, very vehemently, and we had a little conversation about it. But he gave me a very high grade on it.
Wow.
And we had to do a presentation, and this was a course on the psychology of motivation, which is kind of a dry textbook psychology course that you take. You take introductory psychology. There's a course on perception. There's a course on memory. There's a course on motivation. This was the motivation one. It was kind of a dry course, and the lecturer Robert Peel was a very good lecturer and made it as interesting as could be. But then we had these breakout sessions. This was a class of 150, 200. Students, and we'd break out into different sections about once or twice a week, and we would work with the TA in small groups of about maybe 10 students or something like that. And it so happens that Jordan Peterson, who was a PhD student at the time, was my TA for this particular course, and he took this really dry subject and he turned it around quite a bit, made it very interesting, and he took it in a very philosophical direction, and he had us doing presentations for the class or for the seminar. I ended up doing mine on Jean-Paul Sartre and the existentialists.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Cool.
Very, very different kind of thing to have in a psychology course. It's not at all what I expected in a psychology course. And at the time, I was interested in the existentialists. I had studied them a little bit prior to this, before going to university. So it was right up my alley, and I really appreciated the fact that he was willing to sort of try to ground the topic of the course, which was fairly dry, and anchor it in existential concerns, that is, concerns about actual daily life. Now, it's hard for me to cast my mind back that far and remember exactly how he did that, but I remember that I was grateful at the time. So that was my first acquaintance with him, and then ever since then, he had been appearing on TV Ontario. So I live in Ontario, and we have a public provincial broadcaster. It's kind of like your PBS, but sort of at the provincial level.
Did you get to see him and Matt Dillahunty together by any chance? That was in your neck of the woods, wasn't it? Yeah.
Well, what happened was, because I had been following Jordan Peterson's career on TV Ontario on a TV show called The Agenda, when he was sort of the TV Ontario go-to guy for whenever they needed a psychologist or an expert on certain psychological matters when they had a panel discussion. This was a current affairs kind of program. And he would be and that. And he did that for many years, and he came and he left, and, he went to Harvard, taught at Harvard, and then came back to U of T and stuff like that. So I was used to seeing him, and I always remembered him because he'd been my TA, right? And so I had always followed him. And at times I agreed with him, times disagreed with him in these panel discussions. And then he sort of exploded onto the scene because he took this very controversial stand about a proposed bill in Canada. And so he took this very principled stand against it, and he sort of got a lot of media attention. And then next thing you know, he became this sort of very celebrated intellectual on YouTube and all over the world. And then Matt Dillahunty, who's a friend of mine, he was doing a tour where he was going across Canada, doing a sort of magic and skepticism tour. Travis Pangburn, who had arranged this tour, had arranged for him to have a sit-down conversation on stage at a theater in Toronto with Jordan Peterson. Because Matt's a friend, he did this very, very kind thing. He said, hey, listen, I'm going to be in Toronto. If you want, I can get you a ticket, and we can, meet in person and that kind of stuff. And also he wanted to talk to me about Jordan Peterson because Matt and Peterson sort of traveled in different circles, and Peterson had been making a lot of funny noises about the value of religion, and it was unclear what his own position was. Is he a theist? Is he an atheist? Is he an agnostic? Is he a fundamentalist Christian? Like, what is his position?
Actually, just to interrupt your story, what is he? Is he a Christian?
Well, he waffles on this.
Nobody knows.
He waffles on this, and it depends what you listen to.
Yeah.
It's hard to pin him down. I think he is nominally a Christian. He says he lives as if God exists. He thinks that it's necessary to have this kind of instrumental fiction, to posit a God, and it doesn't matter if you believe this God exists or don't. The point is you have to live it as if it does. And my suspicion is I think he thinks that it's really hard to live as if you think something exists and not have some part of you actually believe it. And so... You
know what I think? My take is I think he knows that that's a large demographic, and he wants to appeal to what they think. And I think it's more than that. I think it's more than that.
I think he does want to do that, but I think also he is concerned about certain large existential questions. He's concerned about the big problem of evil. How is it possible that the horrors of Stalinist, Soviet Union could have happened? How is it possible that the Holocaust could have happened in Nazi Germany and things like that? Huge moral catastrophes.
Yeah. But the problem of evil is answered with atheism. Our answer to the God question answers the problem of evil. Believing that there's a God that's omnibenevolent, or however you might say it, that is the problem of evil. That's why there is a problem of evil. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, for me, there's no problem of evil because I think we live in a universe of pitiless indifference.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I don't have a problem explaining evil, but when I say he's concerned about sort of the problem of evil, he's concerned not with how do you understand what evil is, but what do you do about it? And what must we believe? What kinds of things must we believe to avoid falling into these grand moral catastrophes? Now, I'm not defending this position. I'm just presenting.
Right.
I think what he thinks is that unless you posit some transcendental value to human life and human communities, beyond just sort of our, satisfying our animal needs and things like that, he thinks that unless you posit some transcendental value, he calls God, that kind of thing, that which is highest, unless you do that, we are going to end up in these moral catastrophes. So he sees a lot of the kind of malaise of our culture, the problems arising from postmodernism and stuff like that, as consequences of having given up religiosity. In the West, religion served a kind of function in our cognitive and moral economies. And as religion lost its grip, as it ceased to be hegemonic, he sees our culture sort of tottering with a kind of moral nihilism and relativism that he thinks is very, very dangerous. And so I think he genuinely has an affinity for religion, although I suspect in his heart of hearts, he doesn't really believe in a God. But, I mean, that's me playing psychologist here.
I feel kind of bad because I threw us off topic. The whole reason I brought Peterson up was because I wanted to talk to you about postmodernism today, but I interrupted you right whenever you were talking about you were at the Pangburn philosophy debate.
Yeah, so I was there as a guest of Matt Dillahunty, and Matt had wanted to talk to me about Peterson because they don't travel exactly in the same circles, but they both have interests that collide, right? Specifically, they both have an interest in religion and the role of faith in society. And so he knew from our conversations that I was familiar with Peterson and had followed his career for a long time, and that I had this peculiar interest in part because I had met him when I was a young man. And so I said, yeah, sure, we can talk about it. And because Matt was a little worried, he's going to get on the stage, and what are we going to talk about, right? Like, you know, and so he just wanted to know, do you have any suggestions on subjects that we could bring up that you think he'd be interested in, that would be relevant to my audience? Because this was Matt's show, right? So we were going to talk about that, which we did. So we met in the green room and talked about that for a little while before they went on, and then they had their talk, and then I actually had a funny moment in that actually. And this was sort of my 15 minutes of fame. During the Q&A after their discussion on stage, people were invited to walk up to a microphone and talk, and I was like the third or fourth questioner or something like that at that talk. And I had not realized the camera was on the person asking the question. Normally when there's a Q&A, you just hear this disembodied voice of the questioner, and then the camera remains the whole time on the people on the stage. Well, on this occasion, they had this big Jumbotron screen in there so that everyone in the audience could see the speakers on the stage projected up onto the screen. But when a questioner asked a question, the camera was trained on them. So I go up to ask my question, which was of Jordan Peterson. You know, you don't seem to believe that there really are atheists. If there were a real atheist, you know, what would they be like? And then he gave what I thought was just a terrible answer, a truly insulting
murderers
answer
and rapists.
Well, yeah, more or less. He said you would be basically you would be a moral degenerate who sort of proceeds through life with a kind of narrow, self-interested, instrumental calculus in deciding what you would do. He likens him to a character from a novel by Dostoevsky. That I thought was a terrible answer. But anyway, the funny thing for me was just as I started asking the question of him, I happened to look up and see my face, like, you know, 20 feet by 20 feet on camera, and I paused and I froze like a deer in the lights, and then I got my composure. You know, so that was funny. But the funny thing is, so I end up in that video of the two of them talking. So that's my claim to fame. So it's proof that I was there, and I'm very happy that it's there.
How'd you get in? You said you got backstage passes. Did you go by Ozymandias Ramses II? That's insane.
Yeah, well, it so happens that Matt doesn't know my name. He knows me by my YouTube handle. We've been friends for years, but he knows me as Ozymandias, and so he had to call ahead and say, you know, arrange that a ticket would be there waiting for me. And so I show up, and then I realized, holy heck, he doesn't know my name. So I had to go there, and I had to sort of, you know, rather nervously say, excuse me, is there a ticket here for Ozymandias Ramses II? And then, of course, the people in the box office look at me wide-eyed like, oh, you're Ozymandias Ramses II. They had this name on this list. They were sort of obviously curious.
They're expecting to see you like in full
to this name.
Metal Gear with holding a spear or something and a steel helmet.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it was fun.
Postmodernism. My introduction to postmodernism comes from needing to study criminal justice, take criminal justice classes for my political science degree. One of the things that they were talking about was Jeremy Bentham and how he was saying we need to construct a kind of conceptual prison in a way where the guard could sit right at the middle. It's almost like if you had a bird's eye view of the Pentagon, and at each one of the corners or something, there's a prisoner, and there's one guy in the middle that can kind of watch everybody, right? And then I started listening a little bit more to Jordan Peterson, and I have a lot of objections with him. And one of the things that I don't like is his take on postmodernism myself. But I started researching a little bit of Foucault, and one of the things that he said that blew my mind is he took Bentham's concept of having someone watching the prisoners, but the prisoners never know they're being watched, so they always have to act a certain way. He took that and said, that's kind of what we do in our society. You know, post-structuralism, we all kind of watch one another. It's like as if you removed the guard from the center and all the prisoners can report on each other. And that's created this kind of society where we are all creating our own cultural structure and judging one another in a certain way. And I thought, that's genius. That's exactly how I feel. And how much, even though, you know, he was before the SJW movement, how much does that apply to today? How we correct one another, how we try to control one another's speech, how we try to control one another's way of thinking. If you say something wrong, you get judged immediately. Social media is doxing you. I mean, think of that, the MAGA kid with the Indian beating the drum in his face, how quickly that spread. It applies so much to this present time. And here I've got Ozymandias Ramses II. Give me a rough take on it. And maybe if the listener isn't real familiar with it, give them just a basic Philosophy 101 intro, and then also let us know benefits we can take from it and maybe some problems with it as well. Sure.
Okay. Well, postmodernism has to be understood, obviously, in distinction to modernism. And modernism can be seen as a view that starts the early modern philosophers, people like like Francis Bacon and Descartes and John Locke, and you move up through the history of philosophy and Western thought, and you move into the Enlightenment. And, figures like Voltaire and Rousseau and Benjamin Franklin and David Hume and Immanuel Kant and stuff like that. So you have modernism before you have postmodernism. But postmodernism is supposed to be a reaction to modernism. Well, what is modernism? Well, modernism, I'm going to sort of cash this out in terms of slightly anachronistically in terms of Enlightenment ideas, because I think people will be familiar with it. But within Enlightenment, there's this idea that reason is sort of the solution, right? We just need to get away from superstition. We need to get away from religious authority. We need to rely on our senses. We need to trust in science. There was this idea that there is possible such a thing as the disinterested pursuit of knowledge, right? That the truth exists, that there is a mind-independent reality, there is a way that the world is, and a responsible epistemological agent, that is a responsible person in the world who's trying to understand and know what's going on in the world, has to exercise his or her reason. So there's a faith, there's a confidence, a warranted confidence in the efficacy of reason and the efficacy of science. And the idea was that moral values, what they at the time would have called the moral sciences, which we would call sort of like the social sciences, but that would include moral philosophy, that even moral claims of moral philosophy and our notions of values could be anchored in reason, could be justified using reason, right? We didn't have to sort of rely on a holy book, which would have been a pre-modern idea. So in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, as a result of Christian hegemony, there was this idea, there was a certain confidence in reason, but the idea was reason had to work in service of religion and religiosity. It had to be constrained by dogma, right? You could not just have the exercise, the unrestrained exercise of reason. Reason had to be in service of religious doctrine, because that was thought to be absolutely true. It was truth not revealed by reason, but truth revealed literally through revelation from God, through scriptures and things like that, and the supernatural effects from the Holy Spirit and that sort of thing. All right. So, but there was still this confidence that there was a mind-independent reality, that there was a truth, that God knew every truth, and that our reason was put there by God. And so truth was apprehendable. It was at least accessible in principle. It was obtainable in principle, even though we didn't have it all in hand. We could move in that direction, right? But there wasn't a strong sense of progress. But come the Enlightenment, there's this sense that we need to sort of unshackle ourselves from constraining reason within religion, where we can just have what today might be called free thought. And it was coupled with an optimism that arose out of the early success of the physical sciences, things like physics and chemistry. And so that's part of the idea of modernism. There is such a thing as truth, a meaningful concept of truth, that one of the values that we should have, and the reason behind institutions like universities, for instance, and the sciences, is obtaining the truth. And that even our values and morality itself could succumb to the exercise of reason. The postmodernists are people who take a different view. Now, I'm going to sort of leap way ahead now. We're going to be talking about figures like Foucault and Derrida and Roland Barthes and others. There's many of them, but they take this view that in fact the disinterested pursuit of knowledge is hopeless. There's no such thing. There's no such thing as truth. There is simply perspective, right? So most of us would distinguish between your perspective on the truth and my perspective on the truth and some other person's perspective on the truth, and we would recognize that perhaps none of us here is correct in our picture of the truth. We might, at least one of us is wrong, but maybe we're all incorrect. But there is still a meaningful conception of the truth, and we can make progress. We can get closer to the truth. We can move away from error. The postmodern view is that actually, no, it doesn't work that way. There's no such thing as the truth. All there are narratives. There are only stories. And stories work not in service of finding the truth. Rather, the very idea of truth is itself a narrative that is in service of power elites, certain social structures, things like patriarchy, the interests of people in certain classes or certain races, certain gender, and so forth. So the idea is that progress is just a myth. The very notion of truth itself is mythical.
Wait.
Yep.
I feel very intimidated pushing back against Ozymandias Ramses II. Like, immediately once you start doing that, you have dedicated yourself down a path of destruction. But don't you feel like you're being a little harsh, though? I'm getting a weird vibe, and I want you to continue, but would it be more fair to say that they simply were asking us to be skeptical at what we see as truth, because we might be viewing it through a filter of our own culture and our own life's experiences, and that truth as we know it doesn't exist, but there may be an actual truth out there, but there really is no way to perceive it clearly because we all have our own things that are filtering out objectivity in our own lives.
That's a fair thing to say, but I don't really think that is what postmodernism and what most postmodernists are on about. They talk about the idea of decentering, and they talk about the idea of privileged perspective. So, I mean, the average person would agree with what you just said. Well, look, no one has any particular purchase on the truth here, right? We all have our perspectives on the truth, and, we can, perhaps apprehend it dimly to some degree or to a small degree, and people can perceive different aspects of the truth. But the idea within postmodernism is that truth is itself problematical. No one is in a position to establish that they've got the truth. All the people do is engage in power plays, the exercise of power. The concept of truth is itself most people do this unwittingly, but according to most postmodernists, the very notion of truth, the very notion of progress, the very notion of a disinterested pursuit of truth is a folly, and it is in service of agendas. And so really all there is power. There are contests of power. And when we talk about different perspectives on the truth, what we're talking about are competing interests, people with competing narratives and competing and conflicting interests vying to establish their narrative, their truth, right? You hear this expression, my truth, your truth, right? They are trying to problematize the concept of truth. In fact, they have problematized the concept of truth. They think that this ideal that is nowhere to be found doesn't need to be bothered with. We need to dispense with it. We've outgrown this. We need to get rid of this, right? So postmodernists are not taking the sort of the mild, what I would say, fairly sensible view between some of the naivete of the Enlightenment and late modern philosophers, and what I think is the almost self-refuting character of postmodernism. They're not taking that middle road that you were advocating. What you advocated, or what you just represented there, I think is a fairly sensible view, which is, look, we have to be skeptical and we have to be self-critical, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a way that the world is. But within many postmodern circles, this very idea that there's a way that the world is, independent of how we think about it, is nonsense. This is expressed in many ways. It's expressed in philosophers of science like Paul Feyerabend, who just don't believe in any concept of scientific progress. We find it in moral relativism. We find it in epistemological relativism, where people talk about feminist epistemology, black epistemology, and so forth. It's found in literature, in the idea of getting rid of the idea of authorial intent. If you want to understand what a text means, forget the author. We don't have access to what the author was thinking. That's the fallacy of authorial intent. The author's intention in a text, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, doesn't matter. The way to understand a text, whether it's Darwin's Origin of Species or Moby Dick or a movie like The Matrix, the way to understand any text is in terms of how that text can be pressed into service or has been pressed into service for certain agendas, for various competing interests. And a responsible person is someone who understands that there are just these narratives that are in competition with one another and trying to outplay each other. And you need to understand and be self-conscious of the role that narratives play in your life, and that there is no correct way, there's no correct understanding of what Moby Dick means or what the Origin of Species means. That sort of thing. Yeah.
If everybody has their own perspective and everybody's viewing reality with their own biases, specifically cultural biases, right, that really change our understanding of what is happening around us, because we all have our own filter, then whether or not there is truth would almost be insignificant, because that's not something that we can necessarily attain, because even if we all agree objectively on what that true thing is, we could all have an objective bias that we're all sharing objectively, right? So in a way, I appreciate where you say, hey, I don't like how postmodernism attacks science, but if you carry it forward that we can all have a bias and that we're not able to control the bias that we get, we are born into whatever civilization that we are born into, whatever time period we're born into, whatever structuralism we're born into. Even on things that we have consensus, isn't there still reason to doubt as a true and honest skeptic? Isn't truth doubtable?
Yeah, it absolutely is. But I think that the concept of truth is one that is in fact indispensable and that no one actually dispenses with it. I mean, part of the thing that's sort of self-refuting about this particular kind of postmodern claim that the truth is a fiction is you can always ask the person, do you think that claim is true? I mean, what's the status of the claim that there's no such thing as truth, right? Is it true or false, right? And if it's not true, why does it warrant any claim on our attention?
I think
so
Foucault,
there's a difficulty.
Foucault did answer that.
I agree with you that we have to check our biases, and there's always the danger that we're not checking our biases because more or less everyone has been convinced of our particular view. I mean, I'll give you an example. There is in postmodernism a view that the exercise of logic and reason itself, just that, something as simple as A implies B, A therefore B, right? A simple rule of inference like modus ponens, right? First specified by Aristotle, long understood and appreciated and recognized as an important rule of inference in logic. That simple deductive rule is in fact just a kind of strategy, a power strategy, right? And it has a name. This is an instance of phallo-logocentrism, right? Logocentrism. You're putting reason at the center, and the phallo comes from the idea is that this is a male way of thinking because this is a system of a way of looking at the world and understanding the world, that is through reason, that was developed by these dead white European males, and so it's called phallologocentrism. So the idea is that even something like reason and the project of self-criticism and shedding your own biases to see if perhaps you're running awry, right? You're just missing the mark in some respect, and checking with others and stuff like that. Even that process expresses a commitment to reason that many postmodernists think is illicit. And so there's no neutral ground. The idea is that, as they put it, there's no neutral ground. There is no privileged perspective on reality. That's not the same thing as saying no one is in a position to declare that they've got all the facts. That's certainly true, that no one's in a position to declare that. But they're declaring much more than that. They're declaring that the notion of truth and therefore scientific progress and the exercise of reason and things like that, the idea of a way that the world is, that this is all in flux, and that these are all fictions, and they are at best instrumental fictions. Postmodernism is making stronger claims than most people think. They're not making the kind of claim that you just made earlier, where you were saying, we have to recognize that we could all be in the grips of some systematic bias here, right? That's certainly true, but that is not where postmodernism is going. It is really trying to go deeper than that. It's a deeper claim than that.
You're saying that the claim that truth as we understand it could be false, as Foucault would represent, that there's a problem with that logic because you say, well, is that statement even true? Am I characterizing that properly?
Yeah, well, I mean, one objection I would bring to bear is, look, I think that this concept of truth is ineradicable. We cannot avoid it. It's wired into our brains, this idea of a map of reality, of a correspondence between what we're thinking and what's going on in the world. I think that is sort of the model of truth that's operative here. Most people think that when they believe something to be true, when they write the very concept of truth, what that means is a correspondence with reality. And of course, your map can be wrong. That's what it means to have a false belief, right? A failure of correspondence between your view of the world and how the world is. But someone like Foucault thinks that very concept is problematic, and someone like Derrida also thinks it's problematic. Yeah, go ahead. You were going to say something.
Well, I was going to ask, how could your map be correct? There's going to be some bit of flaw to it. It's the same argument that you and I, as atheists, would make about, let's say, the Bible. And we say, well, if it's written by God, then it would be infallible. But it's clearly written by fallible men. Therefore, it can't be inerrant because man cannot be inerrant. That is the flaw of man. To err is human. To reference the same theme, this sounds very familiar to a debate that I understand that you had some assistance with as well, where Matt Dillahunty was debating Cy ten Bruggencate. And Cy says, well, how can you know anything, really, if your knowledge doesn't come from a greater being, as it were, presuppositionalism? And it's almost the same argument where you say, if you're saying that truth is inaccessible, then how do you know that that's a true statement? And Foucault answered that question. He said, I don't. I'm just trying to get people asking questions is kind of my take on Foucault, where in the same setting, Dillahunty responds to Cy ten Bruggencate. He said, you could just be a brain in a vat. You could be in the Matrix or what have you. All the little silly analogies that Precept could make. And Matt's like, yeah, I don't know. He's like, well, how do you even know that what you're saying is really true? And he goes, I could be false about that too. And that's kind of my response back to you. And I think that was Foucault's response.
Yeah, my reading of Foucault is different, and postmodernists generally. But with respect to the idea that your map has to be perfectly accurate, I mean, the concept of a map is precisely the concept of something that admits of degrees of accuracy, right? So, to be in possession of the truth is to be in possession of the truth to a certain degree, right? I mean, if I say that, a certain state in the U.S. is shaped like a rectangle or something like that, I'm not saying it is a perfect rectangle, right? But something can be more or less rectangle shaped.
Sure.
We have provinces in Canada that are more or less rectangle shaped, roughly rectangular, okay, as opposed to Ontario, which is a highly irregular shape, not at all close to a rectangle, okay? So if I said that, Saskatchewan is a rectangle or shaped like a rectangle, that's, to certain purposes, it is approximately accurate. So when we talk about correspondence with reality, right, what we're talking about is the idea of something corresponding to a degree, right? So if you have a map of a territory, the map doesn't map every feature of the territory. It might display, where the lakes and the rivers are, but it might not be a topographic map. For instance, it might not map or represent the terrain, the shape of the terrain, the elevations and drops and hills and valleys and stuff like that might not be represented on the map. Or it might. And even if it is, it's only going to be representing it to a certain degree of precision. So just as a map admits of degrees of accuracy and degrees of precision and imprecision, so our concept of truth works that way. When I say that something is true, I'm saying it's true to a certain degree. One doesn't have to be totalizing about the concept of truth. When one imagines that someone has said something that is true, one means that it's true with respect to some particular thing. One doesn't have to have uttered all of the truth, right? So you don't have to posit that there's a God that knows every true proposition, and that's not a precondition for having a concept of truth. I mean, just think of our concept of truth as analogous to the concept of having a map that represents a territory to some degree. And so one map can be better than another. You could have a map that shows the rivers and the plots of land, and another person could have a map that just shows the forested areas and the lakes, and another person might have a map that encompasses both of those, and another person might have a map that's topographic that shows you all the elevations but doesn't show you where the roads are. It doesn't tell you what's forest and what's a lake and what's a desert or anything like that. So that's certainly true, but those maps are not necessarily incompatible. They might contain inconsistencies. You might have a map that has a road on it, and I have a map that's on a road, and they're both named the same road, but they don't go to the same places, and they have different shapes. And it might be that, how about that? We've got at least one of our maps is wrong, and maybe they're both wrong. But at most one of them is right. At most one of them is right. And then even in its rightness, it's only right to a certain degree. I mean, consider that a map isn't as big as the territory. It represents the territory, but it doesn't actually sit on top of the territory at the same scale. Truth is a relationship between a proposition and a state of affairs. And a proposition is just a statement, like this is a cup, or that is a car, or that is wrong, or democracy is better than communism, or something like that, right? Those are all truth claims. Those are all claims about reality. And when you're making claims about reality, you're making a truth claim. You're trying to represent reality accurately. And that, I think, is an unavoidable concept. But postmodernists think that we should just get rid of that because no one is in a position to absolutely verify that their truth claims are correct. Well, then it's kind of like a free-for-all. There's this playing field that has just been massively leveled, and we don't have to worry about whether your map is more accurate than mine, because every map has to be judged on its own merits, and you can't compare between two maps. You can't compare between two narratives. There's just the narrative that you employ that advances your agenda, and there's another narrative or map that advances a different agenda, and there's no sort of nothing to appeal to, even conceptually. And I don't mean in practice. I mean, there isn't even anything to appeal to in the abstract, conceptually, where you could say that one is right or wrong. So postmodernism is actually a fairly strong set of claims.
Let me present this idea, okay? How about the concept where Deleuze says that we are creating truth as we go? Is that something that you could at least get behind, where you'd say, okay, maybe truth can't necessarily be attained in some absolute perfect way? We all have our different perspectives, our different biases, but as we start to construct these narratives, we are creating a form of truth culturally and through our language and through the way that we live our lives.
Yeah, I wouldn't get behind that construed literally, but I mean, there's a way to construe the use of the word truth there figuratively. If by truth you just mean what we think is true, then yes, of course, we are constructing what we think is true, but we can be wrong about it. We can be mistaken about it. But yeah, of course, we construct truths. If by truths you mean the narratives, the stories, yes, we construct those. Science is a story, right? The idea that the universe arose following a big bang, that there was this expansion. Who knows what was before, if there was a before? But and that you get these particles that freeze off, very early in the evolution of the universe, and that these particles amass and aggregate into huge masses, and you get solar furnaces that go nova and create heavier particles, and so forth, all the way to a universe that looks like ours. Right? That is a narrative. That is a view of reality. That is a physicalist view of reality. Right? Another view of reality is God just spoke the universe into existence, which is what people believed a long time ago, and they didn't have any idea of an evolving and changing universe. They just thought it was fairly static. God just spoke it into existence the way they saw it. Right? That is another narrative. Okay. So yes, we are making truths. If by truths you mean the narratives, right? So someone like Deleuze would believe that, yeah, we are making narratives. But I think that's equivocating on the concept of truth. What he's calling truth there is just our narratives, just our theories, right? Just what we think is true, right? But the concept of truth has two parts. There is what we think is true, and then there's the thing in the world that is the truth maker, that makes our statements true, right? So if I say, I'm a human male, or I live in Canada, or something like that, there are facts in the world that make it the case that I'm a human male living in Canada. If I say I'm holding my human hand in front of me as I stare at my hand, right, there's something in the world besides merely my belief and the narrative and a set of cultural beliefs, shared beliefs and institutions that make it the case that I'm holding a hand.
But hold on,
there's something else, namely that there's a human hand here, right? So the truth maker is implied, right? So there's the thing that bears the truth. A belief bears the truth. A belief can be true or false. A statement can be true or false. A proposition can be true or false. An assertion can be true or false. These are all things that can bear the truth. But then the truth maker is the thing in reality that makes all of those truth bearers true or false.
The statement itself requires that you understand a whole bunch of things. You have to understand what a hand is. You have to understand what you mean by in front of.
Right.
In front of. What does that even mean in the truth maker realm? There is no in front of.
Well, sure there is. I mean, you can have relational predicates. Something can be to the left of something else. Now, if there was only one object in reality, if all of reality consisted of just one stone, right, then it would make no sense. It could not be true that something was to the left of anything else, because there is only one thing,
but
right? And if there wasn't even any space around it, you couldn't even talk of space to the left of it or space to the right of it. So that's a relational term, right? So we can have relational terms like in front of and on top of and behind, and you can have institutional facts and social facts. For instance, if I say the Canadian dollar is worth this much relative to the U.S. dollar, there's a whole set of social facts that make that the case, right? That is, there are beliefs in people's heads that make that the case. So there's some facts that depend entirely on ideas that we carry around in our heads. Right? If no one believed that bits of paper and coins and credit cards and stuff like that could be used as a medium of exchange, I mean, if everyone's memory was wiped on that subject so that no one had any beliefs about such a thing at all, then money would literally cease to exist, right? Because there are beliefs that make that the case. That's a social fact or an institutional fact, okay? But then there are other facts. There are brute physical facts, right? Like, for instance, how many particles there are, let's say electrons in the cup that I'm holding in my left hand right now. There isn't an answer to that. No one's ever going to know that answer. Knowing the answer is different from positing that there is an answer. You can't get as far as knowing or not knowing. You can't get as far as being incorrect without the concept of something being correct, that there at least in principle could be a correct answer. So right now, I mean, I live in Canada. It's wintry right now. I have a backyard full of snow. There's an awful lot of snowflakes in my backyard. No one's going to count them. I'm not going to count them. And in the time it would take to try to count them, some snowflake would melt and another one might form and land and throw off our count. But at any given instant in time, there would be an answer to the question, how many snowflakes are there in my backyard? It's not an answer that anyone could give with any confidence. And it's not one we could ever know to be true. But it is still the fact that there is some integer that correctly corresponds to how many snowflakes there are in my backyard, or how many blades of grass there are on my front lawn, or something like that. The concept of truth just posits or presupposes that there is a truth maker.
Even your analogy of the stone, you said if nothing else in the universe existed except the stone, even that concept is based on a form of modernism and structuralism that is derived from binary thinking. The fact that you would say, even more simple than the stone in the universe, because we're trying to think of like space and what's beyond space and, before the Big Bang, and that could be confusing. A chair in a room. For you to say there is a chair in the room, you are already participating in the binary structured thinking and saying that there is what is in the room as opposed to what is without the room. Outside
right.
of the room. And if you say, well, what is in the room? I took the chair out. What's in the room now? And you say, nothing is in the room. In a certain sense, that doesn't even mean anything from the real truth maker realm with which you're referring. That only means something to us because we're basing it on these kinds of structures of communication, which is binary based. And the universe isn't. The universe doesn't even know what binary means. It just is what it is. And for us to try to find some truth claim about reality, we have to admit the best we can do is have representations.
Yeah, so in answer to that, I would say, cast your mind back to what I had said earlier when I talked about money. Okay, the reason I brought up the case of money is because that's a kind of unusual fact. That's not a natural fact. There are natural facts and there are unnatural facts. There are facts that are born of things that we already believe, right? Your example of the chair, though, is kind of an interesting one, right? If I walk into a room and I see that there's a chair in the middle of the room, right, and my dog walks in, my dog sees the chair and I see the chair, but there's a difference there. I see the chair and the dog sees the chair, but I see that it is a chair. My dog doesn't see that it is a chair, right? If there was a twin cam engine block sitting in my garage, right on my garage floor, and I walk in, I can look at it and I can go, that's twin cam engine. My dog sees the twin cam engine, but my dog doesn't see that it is a twin cam engine. Right? So what goes on in your mind is going to determine what kinds of things that you can know, what kinds of truths you can apprehend, what kinds of claims, what kinds of truth claims you can make. So there are all kinds of truth claims from the mundane, like this is a human hand, which is based in everyone having pretty much a shared anatomy and understanding what we mean by a hand. Like, where does my hand end? Does it end right at the bottom of my palm, or does it extend a little lower, or does it get cut off a little higher, right, beneath my thumb? Like, where exactly does my hand end and my wrist begin? Well, it's kind of fuzzy, right? But there is a fact about whether or not I'm holding up my hand here, even though that fact is in part constituted by us having a shared concept of agreement, a shared agreement about what the concept of a hand refers to. Okay, but the fact that there's some human input into our concepts, there's human input in all of our concepts, obviously, doesn't mean that there's no fact of them. Right? So there are brute facts about the world that we will never know. There are brute facts about the world that we can know. There are institutional facts that we might never understand. There are social and institutional facts that we can understand. The fact, though, here I am. I'm saying this unironically. Mm-hmm. The fact that there are different perspectives on things and that we have shared perspectives on things and that our ability to specify a particular state of affairs, try to pick out a state of affairs when we say this is the case, like this is a human hand, or that's a chair, or that's a twin cam engine. The fact that our minds are involved in the process and that there is shared agreement, just as a linguistic community, agreeing what a twin cam engine is and agreeing what a hand is and a chair is, that doesn't mean that there's no reality, right? That just means that we come up with the concepts that we come up with. And some of our concepts can be screwy. They don't always carve nature at its joints, right? Sometimes we misdescribe reality. We used to think that the expression sunrise and sunset referred to an actual event where, relative to an unmoving, immobile Earth, the sun was moving, right? And then we've come to realize that that's not what's going on. All that's happening there is relative to a stationary sun. The Earth is rotating on its axis and creates the illusion, right? So now sunrise and sunset mean something else. There's still a fact of the matter about whether the sun rises or sets, irrespective of what you think is the ontology or the theory behind what a sunrise or sunset is. So our concepts can evolve, our concepts can change, but at any given moment, given what we mean, something can be true or false. So the veracity of a statement hinges on our concept, because our concept is what's picking out the state of affairs, truly or falsely. So I don't see any particular problem with the fact that we engage in binary thinking. For instance, like if I say there's a chair in the room, a chair as opposed to a non-chair in the room, or something, or there's no chair in the room, right? You can always divide all of reality into two. You can cleave everything in the universe into two things. Everything that is this cup sitting here on my left, and everything that isn't the cup sitting on my left. Everything in reality can be cleaved in half. The concept, the cup sitting on my left, that's a concept. I just came up with it. Now you share that concept, right? You because you are part of the same linguistic community. You know what I mean by a cup. You know what it means for something to be to the left of me, from my perspective. That is the way that I'm facing. There's not a lot of ambiguity there, right? But before there were humans who could invent cups and could have the concept of a cup, that fact wouldn't have been a fact. But it's a fact now. And it's a fact now in part because we have these minds. But that's not a result of a power play. That's not a result of competing interests, I would submit.
But the fact that it is a fact now and was not a fact then, doesn't that validate the argument that the structuralism that you're using to define right or left, and the idea of a cup itself, that these things prove that truth is somewhat relative to the culture that we exist in, or the time period that we exist in, as it were, that there's... Let me rephrase. Maybe we can find common ground here. In the same way that if I would say that the table is clean, I say, kids, clean the table. They know what that means, but is clean really something that we try to achieve, or is there actually a definition between clean and dirty? The only way that we could have that is with binary thinking, and the only way that you could say what is dirty is if we have an understanding of there's certain things that belong on the table. Like, I like to have candles on my dining room table. I don't like to burn them. I just like them to sit there. They're like throw pillows on a bed. It's totally worthless and whatever. But those are supposed to stay there, but your dirty plate isn't. But the very concept of clean itself is based on a structured concept that you never necessarily achieve. And it's abstract.
Well, you achieve the concept, right? You achieve the concept.
But you can't achieve any actual literal reality of clean. So in the same way, like democracy, you can't actually achieve complete, pure, absolute democracy. And the same concept of, what's another good one?
Well, think of a geometric plane. That's one I like to use all the time. I mean, my table is flat, my floor is flat,
Yeah, okay, yes.
Right? Now, there's this concept of flatness. Now, but we have this sort of mundane concept of flatness.
Oh, I love it. Perfect.
Okay? But then there's also the geometric concept of flatness. Now, the geometric concept of flatness is something that is only two-dimensional. It doesn't have a third dimension. There's no up and down on it, right? It is a plane that extends in two directions, right? Four directions, right? Along two axes, okay? And it's absolutely featureless. It has no bumps or rises at all. And it extends along those axes infinitely. It's not a finite, circumscribed plane. A Euclidean two-dimensional plane is infinite, okay? Now, that object is not to be found anywhere in the world, right? But there are things that you can say that are true about that, right? Namely, there are no elevations on it, right? Why? Well, it's true by definition, right? There's all kinds of ways that things can be true. Things can be true irrespective of our knowing them, irrespective of our believing in them. For instance, I presume that you and your listeners believe that there was a world before we came into the world. No one's ever going to be in a position to establish that as a fact. For all you know, the world came into existence with you. In fact, you could even go with last Thursdayism. It's possible that the world came into existence last Thursday, and the food that you're digesting now was all ingested since then. The memories that you have that date back to before that are all implanted and were created in your brain on Thursday. Anything that looks older than Thursday was merely created to look older, right? That's there's no reason to think that that's the case, of course, but that's a logical possibility, right? But presumably you nevertheless believe that there was a time before last Thursday, and presumably you believe there was a time, say, 1 million years ago before you existed, and 1 billion years ago before there were any people. You think that there weren't any states of affairs back then? Truth is just a relationship between a proposition, and a proposition is a proposition that we can specify because we have minds and we can specify propositions, and the state of affairs that makes the proposition true or false. So before there were people, there was a way that reality was. There were facts. There was nobody around to specify them. These were unknown facts. In fact, at that time, they were unknowable. There was nothing around to know them. Okay, some of them now we can know. And then there are facts of a more mundane nature, like that's a twin cam engine. Well, what makes it the case that it's a twin cam engine? It isn't just that it's made out of a certain pile of machinery. It's that it has a certain function, was intended for a certain function. What makes something a $5 bill? If something is a $5 bill, if it exists within a certain culture and people are carrying around certain beliefs about how certain bits of paper and coin and things like that can be used as a medium of exchange. Some facts require some beliefs, and some facts don't require us to believe in them. The fact that minds are required to have beliefs doesn't mean that that doesn't jeopardize the concept of truth.
Okay, maybe we can find common ground to say that truth is something that can't be achieved. It's something that we work toward. Could we at least
I would say knowledge. I would say that truth is happening all the time, right? If I say this is a glass of water over on my right, and then I say this isn't a glass of water on my right, I've just uttered a truth. I don't know which of those two sentences are true if I'm very deeply confused. In fact, there is a glass of water next to me here on my right. But you can utter truths all day long. And all you have to do is utter anything, and then it's negation. It's direct negation. And you will be uttering truths fully 50% of the time.
Give me an example.
So, okay, well, if I say this is a glass of water, and then I say this isn't a glass of water, those can't both be true, and they can't both be false.
Okay, no, you're right. I see what you mean.
So when you've got a sentence and its negation, right? They can't both be true, and they can't both be false. At least one of them is true. So now notice, the concept of truth here obtains even if you're in no position to establish what the truth is. If I say the number of electrons in this glass of water is, and I just put out some big number,
sure.
14 quadrillion, 900, whatever. And I just spew out some vast integer, okay? Now, supposing I say that integer, that's either true or false. Notice it has nothing to do with knowledge. So when you say, we can't have the truth, I think what you're talking about is knowledge. What you're concerned with there is not whether or not something is true, but how would you establish that something is true, right? What you're concerned with there is the verification procedure. And I think that's an important question, obviously. I mean, that's part of why we value science and critical thinking. It's why we use induction and deduction and abductive reasoning, is we're trying to zero in on the truth. We're trying to make our map as accurate as possible. But in any given case, your map is either accurate or inaccurate to some degree. And so the concept of truth is different than the concept of knowledge. You need an agent for there to be knowledge. You don't need an agent for truth, right? That you just have to specify a statement. It doesn't matter if you specify it or it's not specified, as long as there is a proposition, okay? And as long as there is some state of affairs that either corresponds to the proposition or fails to correspond, then you've either got a true or a false statement, right? So truth is not that problematic. I mean, there's lots of things that are wrong with this correspondence theory of truth. I mean, we could have an entire discussion about the shortcomings of what I'm advocating here, which is the correspondence theory of truth. And I didn't mean this to be advocacy for the correspondence theory of truth.
Sure.
What I just wanted to do here was show that the concept of truth is not identical to the concept of knowledge. And what I think postmodernists have in common is they are deeply suspicious of the concept of truth because they are rightly suspicious of the concept of knowledge. The concept of knowledge is actually a little dicey. Right? Who knows if we know? Right? There's arguments about the concept of knowledge. Well, there are arguments that, for why you would have to know that you know it. This is called the KK principle. In order to know something, you would have to know that you know it. You'd have to know the justification for what you know, and you'd have to know the justification for your justification, and so forth, into an infinite regress. Right? If you go with that conception of knowledge, that it requires certainty, and that you satisfy the KK condition or the KK principle, that in order to know a proposition P, you would have to know an earlier proposition P1, and then before that P2, and all of which would be the justification for the last proposition. Then if that's true, then yeah, on that definition of knowledge so construed, we wouldn't know anything, right? You really would have to be a god to know anything if that's how you want to understand knowledge. But there are other theories of knowledge that are not quite so radical and don't make, as I would see it, the mistake of assuming the KK principle that in order to know something, you have to know that you know it. In other words, I think that you can know proposition P to be true without knowing that you know it. And that's sort of a more widely subscribed to view in epistemology, in the philosophy that deals with this area. So I think that what happens with postmodernism is that people are very concerned with all the stuff that we think we know, the things that we call knowledge. They rightly recognize that very often knowledge claims act in service of political agendas, right? I mean, think of racist ideologies. Think of bogus biological theories of race in terms of phrenology and stuff like that, and this racial hierarchy that used to exist in the 18th century and rather 19th century and early 20th century, where races were rank ordered, whites on top and blacks and Australian Aborigines on the bottom and stuff like that, right? Those were bogus biological theories. And those were claims to knowledge that were cloaked in scientific jargon. People who were actually scientists believed these things. It wasn't just people pretending to be scientists. There really were scientists who believed this and thought that they had the imprimatur of science when they were doing this. They thought they were being responsible scientists when they were making these proclamations about racial hierarchies, right? When in fact, this was nothing more than a scientific veneer used to prop up and justify an established view of human races, a bogus biological theory of race, the biologicalization of a pre-existing cultural concept of race. Okay, that kind of thing actually happens. That is the kind of concern that animates a lot of postmodernists, that they realize that, wait a minute, sometimes claims to knowledge, right, the use of science can be pressed in service of nothing more than naked power and efforts to dominate and control other people or to preserve an advantage or privilege. That certainly is the case. But that doesn't mean that there's no such thing as truth, that there's no such thing as knowledge, that it's unobtainable, that is not something that we can recognize and progress in by degrees, right? So you can sort of view the Enlightenment philosophers as being sort of overly optimistic and overly naive about the prospects of science and the efficacy of reason and progress and so forth. And then I think that the postmodern movement is a kind of overreaction to that optimism and naivete that goes too far in the other direction. And it just sort of resolves into all kinds of epistemological nihilism, moral nihilism, or relativism, and ultimately ends up being self-refuting.
Ozymandias Ramses II, I have learned a lot today, and I really appreciate having somebody in my corner that I can push these ideas at. I can throw stuff at you and see what sticks. And I really appreciate talking to you today. I'm sure the listeners appreciate it. Once again, if you are interested in hearing any more of this kind of stuff, I mean, really deep concepts, this guy just breaks it down and simplifies it for the rest of us. Check him out, Ozymandias Ramses II on YouTube. Check him out on Facebook. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure again.
Thank you to Ozzy. Thank you to Dave Blair at davefreesong.com/free music. Thank you to our patrons. You can also support these conversations at patreon.com/right and learn more at therighttoreason.com. Next week, I'll be talking to the executive director of Recovering from Religion, Gail Jordan, about atheists and politics and leaving the faith. Between now and then, remember that you have the right to reason. And then let me get a something about postmodernism for the intro while the music's going.
I'm hoping today that we can talk a bit about postmodernism, and I can give expression to some of the concerns that I have with postmodernism and where I think it goes wrong.
Instead of I'm hoping today, I want to because it's going to be like doo-doo,
oh right,
doo-doo.
Yeah.
Something that's perfect though. That's right on track. But something like I intend to show where postmodernism goes wrong, or something. Pretty much the same thing you just said, but with a more aggressive take, if that's okay.
Yeah. Postmodernism, as I see it. That was going to be totally weird.
You can only speak in the passive because you're too much of the academic to like just be like, let me tell you something, brother, like you're on a wrestling show or something.
Okay, I got another one.
Okay.
I'm not a fan of postmodernism.
I said get aggressive, and you're like, I'm not a fan. I'll use it.
Okay, that's not good. Okay. Okay.
No.
What am I going to say? I don't think it's all complete stupidity, right? And sort of one of the things I liked at the end there was I sort of conceded this important point about biological racism.
Yeah,
right? That is.
No. Okay.
I'll tell you what. Write something.
Okay, how about this? The postmodernist claims that truth is relative are false, and I am going to tell you why.
Okay, that's just way too strong. I can never.
You can say that.
Can't get behind that.